There is something controlling every moment of your life that you almost never notice directly. You wake up according to it, eat according to it, work within it, plan around it, worry about it, and constantly feel like you're either ahead of it or falling behind. It feels natural, almost invisible, like part of reality itself. But it isn't natural. It's a structure, a system that organizes everything you experience into something that makes sense. And if you remove it, things don't just change, they begin to come apart. In the mid-20th century, researchers decided to test this in a way that most people never would. Not theoretically, not through models or assumptions, but directly, using real people placed into controlled environments. The question they asked was simple, but the consequences were not. What happens to a human being when all sense of time is removed completely? Not just clocks, not just schedules, everything. No sunlight to mark a day, no darkness to signal night, no sounds from the outside world, no voices, no interruptions, nothing that could suggest that time was moving forward. Volunteers were placed into isolated spaces, underground caves, sealed rooms, environments without windows or external reference points. Inside there was no change, no progression, just a continuous, unmoving present. At first, everything seemed stable. People behaved normally. They tried to maintain routines, eating when they felt hungry, sleeping when they felt tired, using their internal sense of rhythm to structure their day. They relied on memory, on habit, on the idea of how time should feel. But very quickly, that internal structure began to fail. Because the human sense of time is not as precise as it feels. Within days, participants began to lose accuracy. They thought hours had passed when it had actually been an entire day, or they believed they had slept for a long period when only a short amount of time had gone by. Their perception started drifting away from measurable reality. But the most important part is this. They didn't experience it as an error. For them, this new perception became reality. And that is where things start to shift in a way that is difficult to reverse. Because when a person loses their connection to time, it doesn't feel like something is missing. There is no alarm, no clear signal that something is wrong. It happens quietly, gradually. First, the rhythm changes. Then the boundaries between events begin to dissolve. Then the order itself becomes unclear. And eventually a person can no longer say what happened before and what happened after. Experience stops being a sequence. It becomes fragments. And when that happens, something deeper begins to break. Because control depends on sequence, on cause and effect, on knowing that one thing leads to another. Without that, the world doesn't become chaotic around you. It becomes chaotic inside you. At first, the changes are subtle enough that most people don't notice them immediately. There is no clear moment where everything breaks. Instead, it shifts slowly, almost gently, as if the mind is trying to adapt before it realizes that adaptation is no longer possible. Participants begin to lose their sense of duration. Not completely, but enough to create uncertainty. They eat when they feel like they should eat, but they can't tell how long it has been since their last meal. They sleep when they feel tired, but wake up unsure if they rested for hours or only minutes. The structure is still there, but it is no longer reliable, and that is where the discomfort begins. Because the human brain depends on patterns, it expects repetition, it expects a rhythm. Without that rhythm, even simple decisions become difficult. When should you sleep? When should you eat? When should you stop doing something and move on to the next thing? These questions become harder to answer when there is no external reference point. And over time, that uncertainty begins to grow. Some participants try to create their own systems. They count steps. They repeat routines. They try to divide their experience into artificial cycles, hoping that consistency will replace the missing structure. But these systems don't hold for long, because they are built on perception, and perception is already unstable. As the days pass, or what feels like days, their internal clocks drift further. Some begin to stay awake for extremely long periods without realizing it. Others fall asleep repeatedly, unable to maintain a stable waking state. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness starts to blur, and when that boundary weakens, something else begins to change as well. Memory becomes less reliable, not in the sense that people forget everything, but in the way events connect to each other. It becomes harder to determine what happened first and what came after. Thoughts lose their sequence. Conversations, Even internal ones begin to fragment. And without a clear sequence, the sense of continuity begins to break. This is the point where participants start to experience something deeper than confusion. They begin to feel disconnected from their own actions, as if what they're doing is happening without a clear position in time, without a before or an after. And when that happens, even simple experiences begin to feel strange. Eating is no longer part of a routine. Sleeping is no longer part of a cycle. Everything becomes isolated. Each moment stands alone, without connection to the next. And when moments stop connecting, the mind has nothing to build on. It cannot form a stable sense of progression. It cannot create a clear narrative of experience. And without that narrative, something essential begins to fade. At some point, the problem is no longer about losing track of time. It becomes something more fundamental. Participants stop trying to measure anything at all. The effort itself begins to feel meaningless. Counting doesn't help. Repeating actions doesn't restore order. Even the idea of before and after starts to lose clarity. And when that happens, the mind begins to reorganize itself in ways that are difficult to notice from the inside. One of the first things to change is how memory behaves. Not the ability to remember, but the structure of memory. Events no longer feel anchored. A thought that occurred moments ago might feel distant, while something from what should be hours earlier feels immediate and present. The timeline collapses inward. Everything exists in a kind of flattened state, where sequence no longer defines experience, and without sequence, causality begins to weaken. Actions no longer feel connected to outcomes. A person might stand up, walk across the room, sit down again, and not fully register why they moved in the first place. The intention dissolves before the action completes. Over time, this creates a strange detachment, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet, persistent sense that things are happening without clear direction. Participants begin to describe their own behavior as if observing someone else. Small actions feel unfamiliar. Repetitive movements lose their purpose. Even language begins to shift. Words are still understood, but sentences feel fragmented. Internal dialogue becomes less structured, more like isolated thoughts appearing without clear connection. And as that structure weakens, something deeper begins to emerge. The sense of self, which normally exists as a continuous thread through time, starts to fragment. Not disappear, but loosen. Instead of feeling like a single identity moving forward, participants describe feeling like a series of disconnected moments, each one real, each one clear, but not linked together. And without that linkage, identity becomes unstable. You're still there, but you're no longer sure how the present version of you relates to the version from earlier, or if there even was an earlier. This is where the experiment shifts from being a study of time into something else entirely. Because time is not just a measurement, it is the framework that holds experience together. Remove it, and the structure collapses, not instantly, but inevitably. And when that structure weakens enough, the mind does not simply become confused. It begins to reorganize reality itself. After a certain point, the experience stops feeling like confusion and begins to feel like instability. Not dramatic or sudden, but persistent. Subtle inconsistencies begin to appear in ways that are difficult to explain. Participants start noticing small things that don't seem to align with their memory. Objects appear slightly out of place, not in obvious ways, but just enough to create doubt. A chair that feels like it was closer to the table. A notebook left open to a page they don't remember writing on. A glass of water that seems fuller or emptier than expected. None of these changes are significant on their own, but together they begin to create a sense that something is shifting outside of direct awareness. At first, participants assume it is their own memory failing, that they simply forgot. But over time, that explanation becomes less convincing, because the inconsistencies don't feel random. They feel patterned, repeating in subtle ways, a movement that seems familiar but cannot be placed, a position that feels remembered but never consciously experienced. This is where perception begins to turn inward. Instead of trusting what they see, participants begin to question it. They hesitate before interacting with objects. They double-check simple actions. They stop mid-movement, unsure if what they are about to do has already been done. This hesitation grows, and with it, a new kind of tension emerges. Not fear exactly, more like anticipation without resolution. As if something is about to happen, but never fully does. Sleep becomes even more unstable. Some participants report dreaming while awake, not in vivid hallucinations but in fragments. A sensation that a moment has already occurred, that a gesture has already been made, that a word has already been spoken, and yet there is no clear memory of it actually happening. This creates a feedback loop, because if an action feels repeated but cannot be confirmed, the mind begins to hesitate. And hesitation disrupts continuity even further. Over time, participants describe a growing inability to trust their own perception, not because they see things that aren't there, but because what they see no longer feels anchored in a stable sequence. Events feel disconnected not only from time, but from certainty itself, and when certainty begins to erode, the mind starts searching for patterns, even where none exist. Small repetitions become meaningful. Minor inconsistencies feel intentional, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, reality begins to feel less like something experienced, and more like something that is being reconstructed moment by moment. At this stage, the experience begins to shift from uncertainty into something more difficult to ignore. The inconsistencies are no longer subtle background details. They start to interfere with basic actions. Participants report moments where they stop completely in the middle of what they are doing, not because they are confused, but because something feels wrong in a way they cannot explain. A simple movement, reaching for an object, standing up, turning around, suddenly feels unfamiliar, as if it does not belong to them. The action continues, but the sense of ownership over that action weakens, and that creates a new kind of tension. Because when you cannot fully trust your own movements, even small decisions become unstable. This is where hesitation turns into friction. Participants begin to repeat actions not intentionally, but because they are no longer sure if the action was completed. A cup is picked up, then picked up again. A page is turned, then turned back, then turned again. Each repetition feels slightly different, but none of them feel correct. Over time, this builds pressure. Not external pressure, but internal, like something is trying to align but cannot. And that misalignment starts to affect perception more directly. Participants begin to feel as if moments are overlapping, not visually, but experientially. A movement feels like it is happening twice. A thought feels like it has already been thought, and yet there is no clear memory to confirm it. This creates a loop, because if something feels repeated but cannot be verified, the mind begins to question every action before it happens. That hesitation slows everything down. Movements become more deliberate, more cautious. But that does not solve the problem, it amplifies it. Because the more attention is placed on each action, the more unnatural it begins to feel. Breathing becomes noticeable, walking becomes mechanical. Even sitting still begins to feel like a deliberate act rather than a natural state. And as this continues, something deeper starts to emerge. A quiet but persistent sense that control is slipping. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, enough to create tension that does not resolve. And at this point, participants stop trying to understand what is happening, because whatever explanation they reach no longer feels reliable. At this point, the experience crosses a threshold. The instability is no longer subtle, it becomes impossible to ignore. Participants begin to feel a growing tension that does not release, no matter what they do. It is not panic in the traditional sense. There is no sudden spike, no visible trigger. Instead, it builds slowly, like pressure inside something that has no outlet. Every action begins to feel slightly delayed, as if intention and execution are no longer aligned. A thought forms, but the movement comes a fraction too late. A decision is made, but the body does not follow immediately. And that delay, however small, is enough to create doubt. Because if your own actions are no longer synchronized with your thoughts, then where exactly is control located? This is where participants begin to experience something more unsettling than confusion or fear. They begin to feel separated from their own agency, not completely detached but displaced, as if the self that decides and the self that acts are no longer the same point. This creates a constant tension between intention and outcome, and over time, that tension becomes exhausting. Movements slow down, not because participants are choosing to slow down, but because each action requires verification. Every gesture is questioned before it is completed, and that hesitation compounds. Simple tasks become prolonged sequences of micro-decisions. Reaching for an object becomes a process. Standing up becomes deliberate. Even turning the head requires confirmation. And as this continues, the environment itself begins to feel unstable. Not visually, nothing changes in any obvious way. But the relationship between the participant and the space begins to shift. Distances feel inconsistent. A few steps feel longer than expected. A small movement feels exaggerated. The body no longer maps cleanly onto the environment, and when that mapping breaks, orientation becomes unreliable. Participants begin to pause more frequently, not because they are unsure of where they are, but because they are unsure of how they are positioned within the space. This creates moments of stillness that feel unnatural, not restful, not calm, just suspended, as if something is waiting to resolve but never does. And within those moments, a new layer of discomfort emerges, a quiet but persistent awareness that something fundamental is no longer functioning the way it should. Not broken, but no longer stable. And that instability does not fluctuate. It remains constant. After a certain point, something unexpected happens. The tension does not continue to rise. It does not resolve either. Instead, it changes. The urgency begins to fade, not because the situation improves, but because the mind stops resisting it. Participants describe a shift that is difficult to define. The instability remains, the inconsistencies are still present, but the emotional response to them weakens. What once felt disturbing begins to feel neutral. Movements are still delayed. Perception is still unreliable, but the need to correct it disappears. This is not relief. It is something closer to detachment. Actions become slower, but not because of hesitation, because intention itself becomes quieter. The constant need to verify every movement begins to dissolve, not because trust is restored, but because the distinction between correct and incorrect actions loses its importance. Participants continue to move, to sit, to eat, but without the same internal questioning. The feedback loop weakens, and in its place, a different kind of awareness emerges, a quieter one, more passive. The environment still feels slightly misaligned, but it no longer demands attention. Objects can be out of place, movements can feel delayed, and yet these inconsistencies no longer create tension. They simply exist. This creates a state that some participants describe as strangely calm. Not peaceful, but stable in a different way. Because stability no longer depends on accuracy. It depends on acceptance, and that shift has consequences. Memory becomes less important. Not because it improves, but because continuity is no longer required. Moments do not need to connect anymore. Each one can exist on its own, without reference to what came before, and without that need for continuity, the sense of time weakens even further. Participants begin to describe their experience not as a sequence, but as a series of isolated states, each one complete, each one self-contained. There is no urgency to move forward, because forward no longer feels necessary, and without that direction, something fundamental changes in how reality is perceived. It no longer feels like something that is progressing. It feels like something that simply is, constant, unresolved, and yet no longer resisted. And yet, after enough time passes, or what feels like time, something begins to return, not suddenly, not completely, but gradually in fragments. Participants start to notice the absence of something that used to define their experience. The constant tension is gone. The need to verify every action is gone. Even the discomfort has faded. And at first, this feels like improvement, like recovery. But as awareness sharpens, a different realization begins to form. The structure that once held everything together is still missing. The sense of sequence has not returned. Time has not re-established itself. What has changed is not the environment, but the way it is perceived. Participants begin to recognize that they are no longer expecting things to follow a pattern. They are no longer waiting for moments to connect. And because of that, they start to see something that was previously hidden by expectation. Without the assumption that one moment leads to the next, each moment becomes independent, complete in itself. Not part of a flow, but an isolated state. And within that isolation, a strange clarity appears. Actions no longer feel delayed, because there is nothing to compare them to. Movements no longer feel incorrect, because there is no defined standard of correctness. Everything simply happens, and that changes the experience entirely. What once felt like instability now begins to feel like neutrality. Not order, not chaos, just presence without direction. Participants describe this as a kind of quiet realization that what they thought was breaking was not necessarily something that needed to be fixed, that the discomfort came from trying to force structure onto something that no longer operated within structure. And once that effort stops, the experience becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. The environment does not change, the body does not return to normal, but the relationship between perception and expectation shifts. And in that shift, something becomes visible that was always there, but never noticed. The idea that continuity, the sense that one moment leads to another, might not be a property of reality itself, but something constructed by the mind. And if that construction weakens, what remains is not confusion, but something else entirely. Something that does not rely on time to exist. Something that simply is. By the end of the experiment, the question is no longer what happened to the participants. It becomes something else entirely. What if nothing was broken in the first place? What if the instability, the confusion, the loss of sequence, all of it, was not a failure of the mind, but the removal of something artificial? Because the more you examine what disappeared, the more specific it becomes. It was not perception itself. It was not awareness. It was not even the ability to act. All of those remained. What disappeared was the structure that connects one moment to another, the expectation that experience should unfold in a continuous line, and without that expectation, everything changes. Not in the environment, not in the body, but in the interpretation of what is happening. Participants were not losing reality. They were losing the assumption of how reality is supposed to behave, and that assumption runs deeper than most people realize, because it is not something we consciously maintain. It is something we inherit, from language, from routine, from every system built around measurement, schedules, clocks. We are taught that time moves forward, that moments connect, that cause leads to effect in a clear sequence. But remove the external markers, the clocks, the light cycles, the interruptions that structure the day, and that assumption begins to weaken. And when it weakens enough, something unexpected becomes visible. The possibility that continuity is not something we observe, but something we impose. That the sense of flow, of progression, of past leading into future, is not necessarily a feature of reality itself, but a framework the mind uses to make sense of it. And if that framework disappears, what remains is not chaos. It is something far more difficult to describe, a state where each moment exists independently, without needing to justify itself through what came before or what comes after. And that raises a question that the experiment was never designed to answer. If time, as we experience it, is partly constructed, then how much of what we consider reality depends on that construction? If time is something your mind creates, then what exactly are you living inside right now?